Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, past and present. My name's Tony Katsigarakis. I'm the Director of Client Services in the Enterprise Solutions Group at Wolters Kluwer. And I take great pleasure in welcoming you all to the latest in our series of Justified Trust events, which started with our network event in September last year. Today's session is a workshop on Justified Trust, a year in review. Justified Trust is perhaps the most topical initiative of the Australian Taxation Office with far-reaching and ongoing effects. And we've got a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel that will take you through the discussion today. Chairing today's session is Andrew Dankert, Director of Markets, and I will hand over to Andrew shortly. But before I do, just a couple of administrative matters. If I could ask you all please to switch off your phones or put them on mute. I'd also like to highlight within your packs there is a survey. We'd ask you to complete that before you leave today. And then finally, prior to attending the session, you would have received an email which had another survey in relation to Justified Trust specifically. We're going to be using that to prepare a report and share that with this group. So I'd encourage you to also complete that survey once you get back to your offices. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Welcome. All right, I had one extra chair up there, so it's my fault that we're all so tightly packed together. Look, today we've got, as Tony mentioned, a distinguished panel along with the ATO. So I'll do some brief introductions before we kick off. So to my right immediately is Belinda Darling. Belinda's an Assistant Commissioner for the Public Groups and International and leads the Top 100 program. Next to Belinda is Judy. Judy is an Assistant Commissioner for Public Groups and International and leads our Top 1000 program for the ATO. Next to Judy, we have Michelle Niese. Michelle is the Executive Director of the CTA, a member of the NLTG and on the ATO's Peak Consultative Group. Next to Michelle, we have Zennia Csikos. Zennia is the Head of Tax for Schneider Electric's Australian operations and has experience from the Top 1000 program. Next to Zennia, we have Kamlesh. Kamlesh is the Head of Tax at AGL and has experience from the Top 100 program. And I don't need to introduce Tony. So today, a bit of context. Our format's divided into two parts. For the first part, you'll hear from Belinda and Judy, along with some observations from the panel on four key areas, which are the Justified Trust journey, the stats, key focus areas and ratings from the Top 100 and Top 1000 programs, the future landscape for Justified Trust and what this might mean for you, and lastly, the effective tax borne and Gst Performance Ratios. There's a bit of mystic behind those in some people's minds, so hopefully we can clear that up today. Then we'll have a 20-minute break for morning tea at around about 11 o'clock, give or take, and be back 20 minutes later for the second part of this session, which is the most interesting part in my view. That's where we'll throw it to the panel for them to make some observations, and I might throw them a few curveball questions. And lastly, we'll give the audience an opportunity to ask questions that they might have been sitting on since our last Justified Trust event in September or October last year. Without further ado, I will hand over to Belinda to take us through the first part of the section, being the Justified Trust journey. Thanks, Belinda.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Belinda Darling. I'd like to start this morning's presentation with the year in review, looking both backwards and then also forward-looking in terms of what's next and what's on the horizon. So in terms of preparing for today's presentation, I started with reflecting on where we started and where we are now, as well as what's next. Today's presentation will be focused on both our Top 100 and Top 1000 programs and the application of Justified Trust in both. I consider myself to be very fortunate, together with Judy, to be working on our Justified Trust initiatives. They're innovative, I think, in terms of an approach. It's certainly a challenging space, and I particularly enjoy partnering with our Top 100 taxpayers in terms of providing certainty on the areas where we have assurance and the areas where we need to do more work. And I'm also excited about partnering with more and more Top 100 taxpayers as we attain justified trust and move to a light touch partnering approach. And there's a lot more on that towards the second half of today's presentation. In terms of the timeline that you can see on the screen in front of you, in January 2016, the proof of pilot concept commenced with a trial of the justified trust methodology with 34 key and higher risk taxpayers. In March of 2017, the methodology was rolled out as a business as usual feature in our PCR and ACA work programs for the top 100. The Top 1000 program, led by Judy Morris, started in late 2016 with the mandate to review the next Top 1000 by 2020. The program has now expanded focus to incorporate indirect taxes through the jointly moderated public and multinational business Top 100 population, indirect tax reviews in Top 1000 and Top 100, and the key taxpayer engagement approach, which personifies a one ATO approach to market. We are making substantial progress with our program and findings, and we're here today to talk to you about those key insights, statistics, and some of the supporting commentary. Generally, the findings of our review are supporting our confidence that most large public and multinational businesses pay the right amount of tax. And through this work, we are seeing increased openness and transparency and a willingness to engage to resolve issues to progress to high assurance. In terms of the future, and you can see that in terms of the blue shading on the bottom of this slide, when justified trust or high assurance is obtained, taxpayers will have less intensive interactions with us for a period of time. And the future focus for certainly myself in the Top 100 program is about delivering a differentiated client experience as part of that. Our focus, therefore, is about adopting a light touch partnering approach to maintain that confidence and lessen the intensity of our engagement. And as part of that, we'll be harnessing technology and automation and looking at more efficient ways to collect and analyse the information in justified trust reviews in the future. In terms of the integration of justified trust across taxes, I thought it would be important to briefly touch on the realignment of our client engagement group, which no doubt you've heard about recently. These moves are designed to help align the ATO structure to the marketplace and take a more holistic view of our clients. The changes that we are about to undertake within Public Groups International, being only one of 8 business lines in the broader client engagement group, will see us be responsible for both GST as well as income tax, and the realignment will seek to align the client experience in terms of tax assurance reviews and streamlined tax assurance reviews in the short to medium term. There will be relatively limited changes in the very imminent and short term, and one area that has come up in terms of CTA member feedback is that there won't be any big changes to the way that we currently engage in terms of your key client manager and the income and GST teams that you currently work with. Certainly those ongoing relationships, particularly in the Top 100 space, we'll still be working with you very closely to progress those assurance reviews, and in the background looking to streamline our processes and become more efficient in the way that we work across both tax bases. The one ATO approach is certainly about having a coordinated approach for delivering justified trust across taxes for large and wealthy groups. And in that regard, as you can see on this slide, we are looking at certain initiatives, and we have a working group that sits across a number of business lines whose key focus is towards achieving a greater alignment and consistency in the way in which justified trust is applied to large business, as well as privately owned and wealthy groups sitting across different products. In terms of our key highlights and reflections of the year, our reviews are, as I stated before, certainly providing a positive assurance that large public and multinational groups in the main are paying the right amount of tax. By reviewing our largest 1,100 corporate groups in the level of detail that we seek as part of the Justified Trust methodology, we now have a richer and more complete picture of compliance. The first 2 years of operation of the pilot, both as the trial and then in full delivery, has certainly identified a range of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, areas for improvement, and Judy and I are constantly thinking about ways to work more closely with you to continue to evolve the programs. We've got preliminary insights as well in terms of how the programs will evolve post-2020, and that's certainly something we've both been giving some thought to. And the greater coverage, and this is really at the heart of this particular slide, through task force funding has enabled us to better understand our population profile. The current coverage of both the top 100, top 1,000 programs is depicted here on the 3 charts. And I think it assists with contextualising exactly where we're currently placed in terms of that coverage. If I step back for a minute, though, I just reflect on the populations, just to provide some quick background for you. So the top 100 public and multinational population consists of public and multinational businesses and super funds that have substantial economic activity related to Australia. Our top 100 clients, and I did get quite a few questions at the last CTA session in terms of our moderation process, so again, I'll just touch on that as a bit of a refresher. They are initially identified based on size of their Australian operations, and other factors we consider include things like taxes paid, transparency, behaviours and compliance risks, as well as the influence that the client has on their market segment. The top 1,000 population is determined by turnover, and the threshold currently says 250 million of total business income or higher. And the top 100 public groups pose quite a large contribution, with more than 850 billion in total business income. And the top 1,000, just to contextualise again in terms of its representation of the total business income, is about 800 billion. So there is, between the 2 programs, a very significant component of total company income tax reported to the ATO. And this year in the top 100 program, we have approximately 80 corporate groups and entities and a small number of very large superannuation funds. In terms of the coverage, and this is depicted in blue in your 3 charts on the screen, the coverage we've already achieved through our assurance programs is commensurate with the current scope of the 2 programs. So top 100 is engaging in a continuing one-on-one relationship, and therefore we've got more coverage in terms of that population at the current point in time. Top 1,000, which is, as you know, a 4-year program, is about a third of the way through their coverage, and will have achieved full coverage by 2020. The assurance and compliance work for both populations is allowing us to refine our strategies and approaches and consider wider application across the whole population. Through the coverage, we're certainly seeing increased engagement with taxpayers who are wanting to work with us to achieve a higher assurance rating. And we're seeing that positive and collaborative engagement leading to improved ratings and positive assurance for taxpayers across both programs. Our observations to date show that taxpayers are working well with us and are generally providing quality and timely responses to our requests for information. And we are working to get the majority to justify trust, particularly in the top 100 program. If not this year, then by very early 2020. The next slide has some of our key findings and statistics across both programs. But just before we dive into some of that granular detail, I'll just pause to see if there were any comments from the panel in terms of the Justify Trust journey to date.
Thanks, Belinda. I might start. Just an observation for the audience in case people weren't aware. I know the ATO has on and off always talked about an integrated approach to taxes, and it's always been a bit of a, how do I say this nicely, pipe dream, probably because of the structure of the tax office and having the unusual position of having the business lines sorted in taxes rather than market groups. Most people would be aware that the ATO, I think not last week, the week before, announced that they are essentially collapsing the indirect tax business line into market segments. So everybody working on GST, excise and excise will essentially be working in PG&I now. As Belinda said, and I think this is a really important point, we've had a number of calls about this, any contact points that CTA members or other large corporates have in those taxes will remain. I think that's really important, particularly because I think I heard, is it lift and shift or something like, am I making that up? Yep. Lift and shift, while the ATO is realigning themselves, and I suspect that will, I think the numbers are about 100 staff, 100 indirect tax staff, 130, thank you. We'll be moving...
public groups and
yes.
multinational, there's other groups that are going into the private space
yes,
as well.
Absolutely, yes. So the 130 will move into PG&I,
yeah.
Others will go elsewhere, but anyone with contacts in those points will remain. So that's an important point, I think, to make. The other point I thought I'd make is just on the last slide, it says positive engagement leads to improved ratings and positive assurance. We do agree with that, but I think, the purpose of today is really, acknowledging that we are at a bit of a tipping point there. It is time to, build that last piece of the puzzle, which is recognising the positive engagement that a lot of large corporates have undertaken in the last 2 years or so. And with that recognition will come improved ratings and positive assurance. So that will be, I think, a challenge certainly for the two ladies at the end of the table and for us as well. Finally, a better understanding of the population profile. Something that's been put to me a lot is, and we discussed it briefly at our strategy meeting a couple of weeks ago, is what does the ATO do with all of the data that it collects? Now, we still don't know, but there is a growing interest in that becoming a two-way street, the ATO becoming a little more potentially transparent around what they are seeing, not just in terms of risk, but as you say, population profile, those sorts of things. So I think as time goes on and corporates reflect on how much information they have provided over the last couple of years, there will be a growing interest in getting a better understanding of what that information means at a broader market context.
Yeah, and Michelle, I think that's a really interesting observation in terms of that population profile. It's something that I think through the tax assurance reports and the streamlined tax assurance reports in top 100, top 1,000 programs, that we are potentially much better placed to draw out that richness in terms of insights and intelligence through the two central programs. So Judy's top 1,000 program is more progressed in terms of collating its findings, and Judy will speak to that in a moment. But in terms of the top 100 program, that's something that we are currently working on. We've building a central repository to seek and start to draw out all of the insights and also collate and condense all of the findings across the full population. Yeah. And not quite as progressed as Judy's program, which is certainly a front runner, but we will be looking to share our findings report, which I think will help address some of the points you've just made there, Michelle, about the two-way street and sharing some of what we're learning. We do want to be very transparent in terms of what we are seeing across the population, and I'm hopeful that that findings report, once we've finished it, will be able to be shared with market and we can share what we're seeing, not just in terms of the 4 justified trust components and things like the ratings and the general levels of assurance and the key risk areas, but also go a little bit deeper in terms of what we're seeing across the patch in terms of emerging risk areas and things like that. But Judy, I wonder if that's a nice segue just into the work you've been doing, because you are much more progressed than Top 100 program in that regard.
So we are just in the process at the moment of, I suppose we've got quite a detailed report that we use for ourselves inside the office. A lot of regulator type stuff is in there. But what we're pulling out of that are the insights. What are the issues that we're seeing the most of? So we'll come to it later on, for example, transfer pricing. So why are we finding that transfer pricing is something that we're having difficulty getting to high assurance? In most cases, we still have quite a good percentage that get through to high assurance, but what can we do to improve? So we'll go through those specific issues that attract our attention and why they attract our attention. We're also in the process, and I think it's about 2 to 3 weeks off at the moment. We're talking with our comms people, publishing the type of information we look for. So what do we look for? What would you need to give us so we can get to high assurance? And they will be doing that in relation to our initial request for information, which is also on ato.gov. Alongside of that will be the types of stuff that we're looking for to get to high assurance. So you'll start to see some patterns and trends, and we'll be talking about a lot of that today. And we certainly do share that in our presentations, what we're seeing, but more detail will be provided and put up on ato.gov. End of the month is what we're tracking to actually having probably a written report that's available, and then it should also come up on ato.gov around the same time.
Okay. Any other panel observations from that section?
Yeah, can I just make, before, one last comment. I was reflecting over the last 2 years, having been in Justified Trust from the start back in 2016, the evolution and the refinement in how we have shifted from, the ATO shifted from a risk-based approach where we would review the market for tax risks and look to see whether or not, confirm the existence of the risk and then look to see whether or not we had to actually get to the stage where we issue an amendment. So the traditional audit approach to assurance, that is quite a big shift. And what I noticed today is we're not talking about it. It's understood. So that actually is a huge... I mean that really is a huge development. And also the fact that we use a consistent structured approach to gain assurance. So when talking about assurance, tax gap thinking, that has actually changed the way we're engaging, how we initially engage with the market. There will always be an audit program, but the way that we primarily engage with the market has significantly changed. And I think it's amazing. It's a credit to everybody that people have got on board within the office and outside the office. Large corporates have got on board with this quite significant change. And Michelle, thank you. CTA has played a big part in that as well. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. No, but it has been a big shift for everybody in terms of moving your headspace from risk to assurance. And I'm pleased we're doing today because assurance is a much more nebulous concept than risk. So, I guess the concern with assurance is assurance can go on forever. You've got to get to the point where you say yes, and that's the trick with assurance. So I'm pleased too that we're not talking, we understand the concept, and that I agree, it's good to recognise our achievements, Judy.
So one thing with that I'd say, we've been focusing on obtaining assurance.
Yes.
That's where we've been, and what you're calling out is the next step, which is how do we efficiently, effectively maintain that assurance. I often think that obtaining is a lot more work to obtain assurance, but maintaining it should be much, much easier for all involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's worth moving on to the next section.
Yep.
And that's probably a really nice segue into the next section, which will talk to certainly the key findings and current statistics across both the top 100 and top 1,000 programs. So as I mentioned, we are working with top 100 taxpayers to get the majority to justified trust, ideally this year, with some to follow in 2020. We are well advanced in the delivery of all of our tax assurance reports and have also delivered a number of second-year tax assurance reports, or TARs, with more in the delivery pipeline for 2019. The majority of TARs to date have a medium or high overall assurance rating, approximately 82%, and we've issued 61 TARs to date with the ratings shown on the screen in front of you. 5% are at high assurance, 13% medium to high, 64% at medium, 13% at low, and 5% low to medium. And these are current statistics as at 28th of February 2019. It's just worth touching briefly on two ratings there that you may or may not have seen before, the first being low medium and the second being medium to high. They're unique for the top 100 program, and you won't see them in the top 1,000 program. Those ratings were developed as part of an evolution as we move some taxpayers between ratings, being cognizant that in the top 100 program it is an ongoing yearly engagement. And it's generally indicative of the engagement process we have with our top 100 taxpayers, the assurance work that is still underway at the time of the TAR release, and the work that will be completed in the following year as part of the future assurance plan to move into the next rating. For example, if I touch on medium to high, that's being utilised in the top 100 program where the taxpayer is sitting right on the cusp and trending to high assurance overall. So it's really just another natural delineation point in the rating scale for top 100 taxpayers. Our key objective this year, and it draws nicely on the points just being talked through with Judy and Michelle, is to, starting immediately, providing a really truly differentiated client experience once justified trust is attained, and we'll certainly go more into that. I think it's as part of the third or fourth agenda item today. If a rating in a TAR isn't currently at high, we are continuing to engage with our top 100 taxpayers, and our preference is for a very collaborative approach to working with our top 100 taxpayers to improve the ratings obtained in their reports. We are seeing improved engagement, but there are some tax assurance reports currently trending at the lower end of the assurance scale, and generally they're where we need to resolve specific technical risks and issues, some significant disputes, and potentially there might be some potential difficulties around transparency and engagement as well. ITX currently hasn't issued any separate TARs, but is on track to deliver their first GST TARs in 2019, for the top 100 population. In terms of the overall assurance ratings for the top 1,000 program, the top 1,000 program is also progressing well to meet its goal of reviewing the largest top 1,000 taxpayers by June 2020. To date, more than 320 streamlined assurance reports, or STARs, have been issued, and there are a further 290 clients either under review or notified of a review in the pipeline. The top 1,000 population is very diverse and covers those economic groups with total business income ranging from $250 million up to several $1 billion. As a whole, the population reports nearly $21 billion of income tax. While very significant, it is less than the $32 billion reported for the top 100 population. As part of the design of the STAR process, Judy's program is using streamlined due diligence approaches, which are shorter and not as intense as the engagement in the top 100 program. And the program is working with clients taking steps to improve their assurance ratings. The majority of STARs, similar to TARs in the top 100 program, have a medium or high overall assurance rating of approximately 83% are sitting in that category, currently within the top 1,000 program. In terms of the more granular statistics that you can see on that slide, of the 320 STARs that have issued to date, and there are quite a large number in the pipeline that will be issued within the next 2 to 3 months, so these statistics are very much at a point in time. There is currently 31% at high assurance, 52% at medium assurance, and 17% at low assurance. And the percentages on the slide are broadly in line with the longer term trends that we've seen to date as well in the top 1,000 program. If a rating in a STAR isn't high, then the steps are set out in the STAR report that you'll receive. For example, there may be a recommendation to take certain steps to achieve a higher level of assurance in respect of a specific area. And with respect to our higher assurance taxpayers, we certainly expect you to work with us, partnering with us and taking the steps necessary to implement those recommendations, which we will check next time we engage with you. At the other end of the spectrum, where we are seeing issues or red flag items, things that need to be resolved swiftly, then we'll be advising that they should be escalated through for compliance activity. And at the moment, that is reasonably rare, but certainly there are a few in that category already. For indirect tax, similarly to the top 100 program, the first GST STARs will be delivered in 2019, and there will be a total of 25 streamlined reviews commencing and completing before 30 June 2019. In terms of some top 100 and top 1,000 insights, Judy and I have grouped the key insights for today's presentation in the following slide in the order of governance: tax risk flag to market, significant transactions, book to tax ETB, and the Gst Performance Ratio. And we wanted to share some of our insights with you today. In terms of governance, as you know, the staged approach ranges from stain 3, which is the highest rating, down to a red flag rating, which is where there's potentially no evidence of a tax control framework or significant concerns such as errors identified through the tax return preparation process linked to a lack of operational work instructions. Generally, in terms of our top 100 population, as you can see in the chart on the screen in front of you, most of our top 100 taxpayers are at a stage 2 rating. This means that the governance framework is designed effectively. So we have objective evidence that there is a tax control framework and that it is designed effectively with representations to a gap analysis and assessing the design of the tax control framework against our governance guide. Any gaps or divergence from the guide itself, there's certainly compensating controls that we would have reviewed and evaluated, and they're documented, and we are comfortable that it's a stage 2 rating. And as I said, most of our top 100 taxpayers are obtaining a stage 2 rating. Top 100 taxpayers in the main, and you can see this from the slide as well, are generally tracking at a stage 1. This means that the tax control framework is in place. We have objective evidence that there is a tax control framework, that it's been board endorsed, and there is supporting tax policy documentation in terms of how the company identifies and manages its tax risk, including its documented procedures for preparing its tax returns and business activity statements, and that there's a testing process in place and that that's documented. Generally, we are certainly seeing well-designed tax control frameworks in the top 100. And in the top 1,000 cases, we're seeing tax governance frameworks, in many instances, not well supported by designed procedures. Our aim, though, and I would really stress this, is that when we review our design and operating effectiveness, it's to ensure that tax governance is lived in the context of your business. Where we're satisfied that companies have strong and lived governance, we have increased confidence that governance is embedded in the positions that you're taking and that we can rely on your tax filings and working papers. Early on, we did see a gap, particularly in our top 100 governance reviews regarding independent testings. Many companies didn't have independent tax control testing plans in place or regular periodic reviews of their tax control frameworks. We're certainly seeing a shift now as we are working through governance with our top 100 population, with many taxpayers now actively developing their tax control testing plans. In terms of other insights on governance, and this is just the final point, and it touches a little bit on something I've just mentioned, which is the fit-for-purpose element of our governance reviews, so that where there are design gaps based on our better practice guide, we're seeing more taxpayers now providing information on their compensating controls. And the gap analysis report will often be supplemented with reference to the actual policies and procedures in that business where compensating controls are relevant and applied and working well. In terms of tax risk flag to market, which is depicted on this slide in the bar chart, we are seeing the tax risks we are issuing increasing in number. And in the last 12 months, we've issued another 14 tax alerts or practical compliance guidelines. Our assurance reviews in both the top 100 and top 1,000 programs are still identifying taxpayers entering into arrangements covered by taxpayer alerts, and we are seeing some variations or evolving arrangements as well. Equally, we're also seeing taxpayers who are ending restructuring or shifting out of arrangements covered by a taxpayer alert, which is encouraging. And we're finding across the board that it's those taxpayers engaging with us that are achieving higher levels of assurance, particularly with respect to tax risk flag to market component of the justified trust methodology. Significant transactions are generally consistent with those areas that attract our attention. And on the following slide, there's quite a detailed review of the significant transactions that we're seeing, and we'll talk you through our assurance ratings across the broad topics in a moment. They are consistent in terms of our assurance work generally with the international and domestic focus areas for public groups that we have clusters and strategies established for, as well as the ones that we publish and provide guidance on. The coverage through our assurance reviews confirms for us that the focus areas we have are relevant and feeding into the cluster areas to identify changes or new focus areas that should be considered. And in terms of our GST reviews to date, we are seeing several instances of incorrect GST treatment, particularly with respect to financial supplies, including mergers and acquisitions and large transactions. In terms of the book to tax, ETB and GST performance ratio, there is separate slides on the ETB and GST performance ratio. So reflecting on some of our insights from our book to tax work, particularly in the top 100 population, we are still working to get detailed working papers to explain the difference between the financial statements and the item 6 disclosure in the tax return with respect to your profit and loss figure. Some difficulties that we've seen there today include not being able to see the elimination entries made to group financials to arrive at that item 6 label, not having the consolidated financial statements for us to reconcile back to, and obviously MEC groups pose their own challenges and difficulties there due to the multiple financial statements for the group. The ETB are probably the key element that I'd like to explore on this slide, and there'll be a little bit more on ETB in a moment, is that it's not just part of that fourth pillar or fourth component of ETB, but it's actually we see a part of good governance. To undertake the ETB, we're looking through the transfer pricing documentation, the value chain, the global structure, and the reconciliation between the financial statements and the profit and loss disclosed in the tax return, and working with you to prepare the ETB based on the information we have, sharing our workbooks with you and discussing any assumptions or proxies used. The focus areas on this slide might be a little bit hard to read, so I'll just run through some of the the numbers for you. The high rating percentages for CFCs is 46%, thin capitalisation 71%, and transfer pricing 22%. Probably what I'd just like to comment on with respect to transfer pricing at this stage, it does certainly continue to be a very common area of assurance in both the top 100 and top 1,000 programs. Judy and her program are finding that most of the top 1,000 population do have international related party dealings, and about 2/3 of all TP issues are rated either high or medium assurance at the moment. In terms of a finding from the top 1,000 work streams, it's about the remaining 1/3 which are either rated low assurance or red flag. And we thought it was worthwhile today just exploring why we're not getting to high assurance for transfer pricing reviews in a top 1,000 setting. And that commonly includes probably 3 key elements. So the first is insufficient transfer pricing documentation. The second is either poor economic or tax performance coupled with concern in terms of arm's length nature of transfer pricing policies. And then the final component is further evidence or analysis needed to confirm the functional analysis, the characterization of entities in the value chain or the cost base of transactions. And really to do that final component can be quite challenging in a 4-month review. And I think that's demonstrative of where we're currently seeing the transfer pricing assurance ratings landed. In terms of the domestic issues, which you can see at the bottom of the slide in front of you, again, just in case those statistics are hard to read, so CGT or capital gains tax is 67% in terms of a high rating, depreciation 54%, R&D 39%, general income 69%, and general deductions 46%. So these statistics are across both the top 100 and top 1,000 programs. And just for ease of reference on the slide, and the respective findings reports for both top 100 and top 1,000 programs will be much more granular and will break down the sort of high, medium, low red flags in terms of some of our percentages, particularly for top 100. Just for ease of reference today, we've amalgamated the low, medium red flags into what you can see there as the yellow shading on the chart. So we do often get questions in terms of the best way to obtain a high assurance rating. And this slide sets out some of the things that you can do in terms of preparing for either a top 100 or top 1,000 review. I think the best way to obtain an assurance rating, simply put, is to work with us in a collaborative way. We have the same end goal, which is to arrive at justified trust. So I think if I was about to receive or undertake a top 1,000 review within a company, I would talk to your team and understand what they're trying to achieve, understand for them where the focus will be in the justified trust work streams and how you can help them prepare early to get the information across in a timely way. I think being prepared for our interaction is also helpful, and Judy's program's taken steps recently to provide early notification and engage early where you can. I would keep across the taxpayer alerts as well and document your position so that going into that review, you're very well prepared to talk to the tax risks most pertinent in your business and explain your position with respect to our published guidance. In respect of the book to tax element, I think documenting the reconciliation between the financial statements and the item 6 profit and loss, as well as the elimination adjustments, will be key to helping the team work quickly through that final element of the justified trust methodology. In our experience, it's those taxpayers that work with us to provide comprehensive documentation up front to explain the business and the book to tax process do tend to move through the process quicker and attain a higher rating, and equally resolve issues faster as well to move things to a higher rating where there's early concerns identified or areas that are unassured because we might need to do some more work. So this slide just sets out some of those key themes in terms of what you can do with respect to early documentation, which types of detailed work papers will be good to have on hand, particularly explaining the global value chain, supply chain, inbound and outbound global structure, and how and why your tax results vary from your accounting results. They will be exactly the types of questions that your team will be wanting to work with you on. So that would be something to do in terms of early preparation. There is a reference there to ato.gov.au where you can find the modular request for information in a top 1,000 2000 review, as well as our tax risk management and governance review guide, which is the guidance that we use to progress our governance reviews in justified trust work streams. And then the final point on that slide is just touching on transfer pricing documentation, particularly including offshore branch and financing transactions. We are finding, in respect of transfer pricing documentation, there are some elements of the business that are very well documented, and then other aspects, particularly around branches and financing, which might not have quite the same level of documentation in place. So I might pause then, just like we did last time, and give you an opportunity to hear from the panel before we move on to that next piece, which is the future landscape once justified trust is obtained. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, please go.
I'm just wondering, the slide that talks about 64% are in the medium range, and then on slide 8, I think we're showing less red. What are the drivers? What's driving the 64% medium? I would have expected a higher number, as in not a high number in medium, but higher up the scale. Is there any particular drivers to that?
Medium top 100.
Oh, okay. So in terms of the median rating in a top 100 context, I think we're finding at the moment in that population that we are dealing with some very complex, very large taxpayers. It can be very time-consuming with an assurance lens to obtain assurance across the full business. And in the Justified Trust reports that I have worked on and reviewed, certainly the ones which are landing at medium might not necessarily be representative of large-scale issues that we have and compliance work streams underway, although certainly there are taxpayers that do have areas that are being further progressed in compliance activity like audits. But there is also a large body of top 100 taxpayers that are at medium just because there is further work to be done. And that's where a critical piece of the TAR report is to read it with the future assurance plan and say, well, I'm at medium now, but I can see that's because there's still some more assurance work to be done with respect to, say, financing, R&D, and some of my transfer pricing elements, and that once that work's progressed, then I should naturally continue on to high assurance. So at the moment, in terms of a medium rating, I certainly say that the two drivers are complexity and size, just in terms of being able to assure the full business. But Judy, did you want to reflect, because you're sort of in a similar position that you have also a large number of mediums coming through your program?
We do have a large number of mediums coming through our program, and I initially thought my first reaction was, well, we get to medium, it's almost the flip of what we need to get to high assurance. So the messaging that we're sending about to get to high assurance, please work with us, understand what and why we are looking for something so you can address our concerns, because we'll often get to medium where it could be right, may not be right. We don't have enough to have confidence in the outcome. And it may be for a range of reasons. So I think, for example, if we get a really short answer, almost an historical approach to an ATO question, give the ATO as little information as possible. We still get that occasionally, and that you can almost say there's no way in the world we can get to high assurance on a 2-line answer to a question. That's why we say we need the documentation, we need to be able to step through things, and the depth of the information that we're looking for is a lot more than what we have traditionally, where we used to make a call on risk. Now we need to say we've got confidence it's right. In the transfer pricing space, that is probably one of the most common issues that we see, and we are working on in the transfer pricing space to really provide some more guidance about how we can get to high assurance in that, because one of the things that Belinda called out was the need to do the more in-depth, detailed analysis. And realistically, can we do that for 90% of our population? So we are working on other ways of addressing that at this point in time.
Okay. I think the point that Kamlesh makes is a good one, because if you look at your stats there and the comment, most top 100 taxpayers should attain justified trust by 2020, you're going to have to move a lot of taxpayers out of the medium, high and medium space to achieve that. So now what most means, I'm not sure, 60%, 75%, and I suspect we'll get into that a little later. But I guess the question that a lot of people in the audience may have is there sufficient, is there any disconnect between what the ATO thinks corporates are willing to do or can do in terms of moving from those areas to high? One of the concerns I'm starting to hear from corporates who always understood they had a fairly, open and transparent relationship with the tax office, have been subject to PCRs for some time, is, when they're up to their 342nd question on their RFIs, are they ever going to get there? What more can they do in terms of providing further documentation to get them there? So I guess I'm just identifying that potential. I suspect we're going to be okay, but I think a lot of people in the audience may be feeling, well, I'm not sure what you think, what the ATO is thinking we need to do in terms of moving to that high space, and the reality of what we can or should provide as well. So I think that's just worth pointing out as well. The other thing, and Belinda, we're getting to the exciting bit in the next section, so I don't want to jump the gun, but on the PCGs, I think what we're always saying to the tax office is, PCGs are a risk tool. They're not an interpretation of the law. Taxpayers like to see them used as such, and certainly in conversations we have with Second Commissioner Andrew Mills, our view is that if you are medium to high in a PCG, that should be the commencement of discussions with the tax office, not the end. And I think, Belle, we get to that point in one of your qualitative factors where the ATO has identified that there is an issue. As long as it's been dealt with and discussed, that does not necessarily discount you from getting to a level of high assurance. So I think that's something that people will be very interested in as well.
Can I just, after you.
Yeah, so I was just going to continue on from, I suppose, the PCGs and the taxpayer alerts. Are they very much being driven by people in the low assurance area that you're seeing and the risks identified in that? Or are they actually being driven from different areas in terms of just what you're seeing in terms of marketing of different arrangements?
Well, I'm happy to start on that, and we have a whole bunch of colleagues here as well who can provide some more observations. So PCGs and taxpayer alerts, it's part of our strategy to advise the market of how we view, I suppose, areas where there have been some uncertainty, so that you can self-assess or you can understand by applying these tools to understand where you, I suppose, how we view you and whether or not we will apply compliance resources. In that, will we ask more questions? Will we look more deeply? And depending on where you sit in relation to a taxpayer alert or a PCG. So we want people to be able to make informed decisions about whether or not they take on tax risk. So that's the strategy, and it fits nicely. I see it as sitting alongside what we're doing in our assurance reviews. And they are designed and they are developed by people in our risk areas and our risk and cluster areas. What we see in our programs feeds into that, but a lot of these were underway and the issues were identified, I suppose, separate and apart from the work that is coming out of our programs. So any of my colleagues like to add anything on that at all? No? Belinda? No?
Yeah, we might move on to the next section.
Okay, sure.
Make sure we've got enough time.
I might just add, sorry, but before Belinda starts, in the top 1,000 there is another stream of work, and we're very fortunate to have Rob Thompson here today, sitting in the front row. We've got a number of quite senior ATO people here with us when you have some questions. So Rob is leading the work in the top 1,000 to 120 taxpayers, large APRA super funds and investment industry MITs. It's a data-driven approach, so it's a much shorter, more efficient way of reviewing these large businesses. And so that 120 is wrapped up in our numbers. So.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Rob. I'm glad you came, Rob, to sit in the front row today. So in terms of the next section, we'll be speaking about the future landscape once justified trust is obtained. In this section, really exploring what does justified trust mean and how do I get there? So it means that we've obtained assurance that the taxpayers paid the right amount of tax for the review period. It's obtained through the assurance review covering the 4 focus areas of the justified trust methodology. In terms of how we practically go about obtaining and determining a high assurance rating is the same in both programs, and because the methodology that's applied in Top 1000 is the same as Top 100, consistency is very important in terms of our underlying integrity. We have technical support for all teams from different clusters, and the Top 1000 specifically has its own technical core team to support all streamlined assurance reviews. We also have quality assurance processes to ensure quality and consistency across both populations. And for both groups, there is a final workshop with operations and justified trust assistant commissioners, senior staff case teams, and relevant technical clusters. And that's to ensure that we have a robust and rigorous approach internally to applying principles for obtaining overall high assurance. And I just wanted to touch on that because it is a question that we do get quite regularly. There is a lot of interest about the internal processes, so I just thought I'd touch on that briefly. So in the Top 100, we will be adopting, and this goes to the point at the very bottom of this slide on the screen in front of you, a principled approach to achieve overall high assurance based on qualifying factors, which I'll touch on in one moment, as well as a quantitative threshold. So put another way, if you are a Top 100 taxpayer, you will achieve justified trust if there's a percentage of tax assured or economic activity correctly reported. And in terms of that percentage, we're thinking currently around 90%, and that there's a number of objective qualifying factors are met. And I'll just walk you through each of those now. So the first being that governance is at least a stage 2 in your tax assurance report. So stage 2 or stage 3 in terms of governance will make you eligible to attain justified trust. The second component, and this was touched on briefly by Michelle Niese in her earlier comment, is that any tax risk flag to market, whether it be in a PCG, a tax alert, or a public ruling, is where it's rated low or medium in the tax assurance report is not also identified as warranting further action, which is being captured in the future assurance plan. So in terms of your tax risk flag to market, as long as there isn't further action that's proposed by the ATO and set out in your future assurance plan, again, that's an eligibility criteria for justified trust. There is one exclusion that I'd like to note, and I'll touch on this in a little bit more detail in a moment, which is where you have an area that's already under active compliance review or audit for a PCR taxpayer, or one that's outlined, if you're an ACA taxpayer, in your unresolved issues register. That won't of itself be enough to disqualify you, and it is possible to still obtain a provisional justified trust rating in that setting. But I'll just put that to the side for one moment and we'll circle back to it once we've run through the other qualifying factors. The third one is international related party dealings and CFCs have both received at least a medium level of assurance in your TAR and no further action proposed or planned. The fourth one relates to losses, and acknowledging that this won't be applicable in all instances, but if you have losses either that are incurred in the current year or which are being carried forward from a prior year, that they've received at least a medium level of assurance in the TAR, including that we've reviewed the commerciality of those losses, it's been verified, we understand when you will utilise those carry forward balances and pay tax, then that of itself is another green tick as shown on the slide in terms of those qualifying factors. The ETB calculation is qualifying factor number 5, and this is that the ETB calculation in the TAR and any underlying assumptions or proxies have been verified with you, and that the ETB calculation hasn't highlighted any new areas of concern for us, including, for example, the use of tax havens where there isn't a substantiated commercial purpose. It doesn't mean in every instance that we need to have a high resolution ETB. It could be sufficient to have a lower resolution ETB as long as I've said, the teams work through the assumptions and proxies with you and you're reasonably comfortable that they're sufficiently accurate. Qualifying factor 6 relates to the reportable tax position schedule disclosures, and largely that there haven't been any large inconsistencies identified between lodgement of the tax return and finalisation of the TAR in relation to the PCR and ACA, depending on whether you're a PCR or ACA taxpayer. And the seventh one, which is the final qualifying factor, relates to cooperative and collaborative behaviour. And what we mean through that factor is that there's been cooperation throughout the review. There's no behaviours demonstrative in the course of the assurance process that would, say, hypothetically meet the criteria for increased penalties if a tax shortfall existed. So things that we're thinking about in that realm are preventative or obstructive behaviour, repeated failure to respond to information requests, false or misleading statements. In the main, in our top 100 population, I would expect most of you to be able to meet that qualifying factor. One thing I would add is that all of the qualifying factors must be met. If one of the factors isn't met, then it won't be possible to attain justified trust. And just to circle back to something that I touched on earlier, it is still possible to attain justified trust where you've met all of those qualifying factors, but there's a red flag in your TAR or compliance activities for the income year covered by the TAR. This means that if you have a specific risk or issue under review or audit, or there's an area red flagged in the TAR, it could still be issued with a justified trust credential, but it will be qualified until such time as that review or audit or red flag has been resolved with the ATO. The justified trust credential and the enclosing letter with the TAR will acknowledge the review and audit activity underway, and the light touch approaches that we'll explain and explore in a moment as part of today's presentation would also be tailored to reflect the circumstances and reflective of that audit and review activity underway as well. So in terms of the benefits of justified trust, there is a justified trust credential in development, but taxpayers who work with us to attain justified trust, the benefits include reduced compliance costs in future years where those arrangements remain largely unchanged. And I felt Judy articulated this really nicely before when she spoke about the difference between obtaining justified trust and maintaining justified trust. We'll be able to provide greater certainty over your tax affairs, and there will be lighter touch approaches as we shift to more service-based approaches and less intensive assurance-related engagements. And I felt like this goes to the heart of Michelle Denise's earlier point about the tipping point from being on the justified trust journey to what happens once we're there, and we'll explore that in the next slide as well. So in terms of how we hope to deliver on those benefits that I've just articulated, we are working on a justified trust credential, and this is a snapshot of a template that's currently still in development. But we would like to be able to issue the justified trust credential for taxpayers who want to promote and advertise their good standing, such as through messaging in their annual report, voluntary tax transparency code, or on their website. This was based on member feedback from the CTA members, as well as the CTA and other external stakeholders who recommended that it would be worthwhile to have something like this developed as part of the Top 100 program. It's in the approval stages at the moment, and I am hopeful of having it available for clients who attain justified trust shortly, and that's a snapshot of what the current template looks like. The other way that we're looking to deliver the benefits through a tailored client experience once you reach justified trust, and we'll walk through that in a moment. Judy and I have been speaking about the justified trust credential and whether in the short term it's something that sits in the Top 100 program rather than necessarily in the Top 1000 program, largely representative because of the duration and intensity of a Top 100 review and how that differs from a Top 1000 program review. So in terms of what happens next, and I've spoken a little bit today already about how the experience will be different once justified trust is reached, and that's something I'd like to walk you through now, and it is set out in summary on this slide. So I see differentiation as fundamental to how we engage with Top 100 taxpayers, both during and after a justified trust assurance review. And tailoring is really important to recognise the trust that we have achieved once we've reached high assurance. And you may have heard us refer to that differentiation as partnering, encouraging and influencing approaches, which I think you can equally think of as light touch, medium touch or high touch. But it's the partnering approach for justified trust taxpayers that sets the experience apart from taxpayers who need encouraging or influencing to get it right. And it's that partnering approach that I wanted to spend most of the time discussing today. So the light touch justified trust maintenance plan for Top 100, which largely, if you think about it in three categories, and if we touch on the first category now, it's the rely approach. And that is where, once we've attained justified trust with you, we will trust you to tell us, and your tax governance will effectively identify new tax positions, errors, and new transactions. And therefore, we can move to a light touch approach on a cycling basis. So in terms of a PCR, and I think it's in the top 100 population, we have two distinct categories of taxpayers, our PCR taxpayers and our ACA taxpayers. So in terms of a PCR taxpayer, there will be a tailored rolling plan of engagement developed. The light touch approach and the depth of engagement will vary between years based on whether justified trust is being, as you can see on this slide, relied upon, verified, or refreshed. And I'll walk through the principles that sit under each of those three components in a moment. But it is anticipated that there could be a minimum of 2 rely years before a full refresh, being a full intensity JT review in that third year. In ACAs, it's anticipated that the ACA work program will continue, applying the principles of justified trust as part of the approach for ACAs, consistent with the current drafting of our ACA income tax pro forma schedule. The internal and external documentation to continue in that TAR format for consistency, but that will be very much abridged and streamlined. There's currently a review in terms of the strategy for our ACA program, but certainly in terms of the experience for an ACA taxpayer once you reach justified trust, it will become very similar to a PCR in the sense of the JT component of your work stream, recognising that in an ACA there are additional work streams to provide that further practical certainty in each year. Oops, sorry, I've just gone a little bit too far. Let me jump back one step. So in terms of the rely category, just to explore that in a little bit more detail, the slide's quite high level, so just bear with me while I walk you through some principles in terms of the rely approach. We will trust you to tell us if you're taking new tax positions or changing tax positions that we've previously assured, as well as identifying errors or disclosure issues that should be corrected. And we'll be asking for that annually in terms of a short confirmation. In the background, we'll be using our data and analytics capacity and risk and operations staff to review and monitor your reported information and disclosures. We will be significantly scaling back all of our usual intensity, and that means that the usual one-to-one engagement that you've been so used to in the past won't be required unless you engage with us and seek our advice on significant or new transactions, or our systems and data analytics and staff detect a reason to intervene. In terms of verify, we fully acknowledge that in the top 100 population, it's not static. There are, in any given year, a number of business changes and transactions that impact on areas where we might have previously given you assurance. What we will do in terms of justified trust, that is a mouthful. What we will do in terms of justified trust taxpayers where there is a business change is to trust you and provide the evidence necessary to verify those new transactions or significant changes, but our focus will only be on those areas. So it will be limited in scope to those new transactions or changes, and if it's a dial, we'll be turning down our usual intensity. So that verification will be a very focused and well-scoped review of new transactions not previously assured, significant business changes, or tax risk flag to market, for example, not covered by a Category C disclosure, or something that's identified through our data and our analytics systems. Because we still have the ongoing basis for trust, the additional verification will commonly take the form of taxpayer confirmation, attestation. We won't be drilling right down to source documents in regards to the scope of that work. Things like governance, for example, wouldn't need to be reviewed in detail unless those new transactions are seen to be having an impact on your governance framework and the rating given in the last tax assurance report. Equally, if you are wanting to engage with us to move your governance rating, say from example from a stage 2 to a stage 3, in order to get that highest level of governance rating, more than happy, and we would be supportive of you doing so. The documentation that you receive in terms of the TAR will be significantly abridged, and we'll just cover those transactions that we've verified. In terms of a refresh, I'll just touch quickly on those principles, and this is the bucket that sits on the far right of your slide. To have a robust basis to assert we have tax assured, it might be necessary in some situations to refresh our understanding and evidence base. That could be because there has been a fundamental business change, for example, a takeover, or we have reason to consider that our trust should no longer be maintained, or there's been 2 review years that have elapsed since a full intensity review has been undertaken. And in the refresh year, we will be resuming our usual intensity for the review year, but we will only be looking at that review year, so that the 4 focus areas of justified trust will largely be focused on things like significant business changes, new transactions, a sample check of ongoing transactions if they're material or there's been a key change, governance, operational effectiveness, probably just a recheck-in, only looking at changes in your book to tax position. And it's the ETB where we'll probably look to do more of a trend analysis. So we will look to run the ETB for the earlier income years not covered by the full TAR, and we will set that out in a tax assurance report. It probably won't be as long as your current ones, but it will have a substantial body of work that sits behind it just in terms of refreshing our trust and overall assurance rating. So practically what that might look like, and we've got a few taxpayers in this space at the moment. In the PCR letter that's just gone out, for example, we highlighted that we will work with them to assure new transactions. We'll meet with them prior to lodgement of the tax return, largely just to discuss tax performance and any changes. There is continuing access to the key client manager, as well as the dedicated key account manager in the large service team. So none of those service offerings change. And the letter just outlines that we'll be using data and analytics capacity in the background to review and monitor reported information and disclosures. So happy to pause there because that might be a nice spot to take questions. But maybe just before I do that, I would like to touch on the Top 1000 program, because a lot of that content in terms of differentiated client experience has been quite specific to the Top 100 program. In terms of the Top 1000 program, it's really important in the streamlined assurance review ratings, it is that rating that will inform and determine our resource investment next time we engage with you. High assurance means that we can apply less intensive approaches and that you have greater certainty in terms of what that means next time we engage with the Top 1000 population. And Judy's analogy I thought was quite beautiful before about maintaining high assurance consumes less time and is more cost effective than the work stream that's done to invest in high assurance. And we have our colleague Tom Wheeler, who is here from Adelaide, who leads our next action work. And it's Tom's work stream that is looking at how, in terms of working through those critical next actions where there's issues flagged that require attention, Tom's program's working on that through, and he'll be available in the morning tea break if you've got particular questions on your next action piece of work.
And I think we need to recognise that this is what we've been asking for in terms of a bit of a line in the sand between where we all feel we've been for some period of time and obtaining high assurance and justified trust. Obviously, the proof will be in the pudding and how these objective 7 qualitative steps are interpreted by the tax office, but certainly I think it's, from the CTA's perspective, we have to acknowledge the work that the tax office has done in delivering something that is tangible in this space. So thank you for that, Belinda. I should note on the justified trust credential, the reason why our name is being, I guess, attributed to its development is because the tax office has always asked us, if taxpayers achieve justified trust, do you think they would be interested in making that public? And our response has always been, I don't know. It'll be completely up to the taxpayer whether they do that or not. However, if they do, the ATO probably should have some control over how that is done, and so that's why we're looking at some sort of template which marks that point rather than sort of an ad hoc approach. So it's essentially what we're looking at, and I guess the important point here is to acknowledge if we get how many taxpayers we do get in that high assurance space, and based on the section that we were discussing last time, the ATO is suggesting most large corporates will be large top 100 will be in the high assurance space. You're talking a 90%. I always get qualitative and quantitative mixed up.
Quantitative.
Which is very telling. I'm not very good at maths, but anyway, thank you. 90% which should indicate that not every stone will be turned over. Obviously, in a large corporate, if you turn over every stone, you could potentially be there forever. So I think that's an important point to note. The 7 qualitative factors, as I said, will very much depend on how those are interpreted and how I guess achievable ticking the box on all 7 will be. And I suspect that's where we'll be doing some ongoing work with the tax office. The important point to note is the 3-year cycle and the noticeably lighter touch that you will receive in that period of time. Essentially, Bill, what it sounds like is a check in pre-lodgement. Otherwise, the tax office will rely on information it already receives, whether it be by IDS, RTP, country-by-country reports, noting the verification and refreshing areas if anything in particular arises. But other than that, certainly the message that we are receiving is that it should feel very different for taxpayers in that 3-year space. Following that 3-year space, you will have a renewed look, but that will be a forward look rather than a back, which is important, I think. So, yes, this will be the space that I suspect we'll be talking about in a year's time, probably in this room. Any observations from members?
Yeah, I just have one, which may be more of a comment or something that we can debate. But look, firstly, I should preface and say, yep, this is great, and I think we'll get to a really good place along this journey in 18 months' time. But the slides that really stand out for me from the last section was the 4 pillars. So when we talk about the governance, tax risk flag to the market, significant transactions, and ETB effectively. That slide, together with the one that, what does justified trust mean? Well, paying the right amount of tax. Well, Commissioner's already said the gap is a lot narrower than what was previously thought. And then the guiding principles. I just wonder whether we can get to our destination faster and further up the curve by pivoting. I get it that the ATO has to really go about it scientifically so that all the taxpayers are treated, fairly. But a lot of corporates will say, I do pay the right amount of tax. There's good reasons why, the ETB is lower than my effective tax rate, say, of around 30%. I look at the criteria, various stages, kind of get there. I wonder if there is an opportunity to pivot within the ATO to kind of say, is this do we need to change something so that we can get there faster if we are paying the right amount of tax?
Maybe if I can understand the question, just confirm my understanding. You're looking at the 4 focus areas that's justified trust methodology, and wondering whether, so as part of our evolution and refinement, whether we should be looking at some of those areas as well, so that we can accelerate the journey.
Yes. Without having to, we're getting to a stage where there's so much information being provided. I just wonder, when you provide the nth degree, that sort of documentation, are we really getting further up the curve? 80-20 rule, we get there materially. And it then allows us to actually have that discussion to say, you know what, you're getting there, but these are the holes that you need to fill. And gives us greater clarity sooner rather than getting bogged down in a paper war. It does take a hell of a lot of time. And we've said before, we're having to do more with less. There must be a better way.
And I think that's a good point. I think great minds think alike in the sense that, not that I have a great mind, I'll attribute that to the operations SES in each of the sites, but they are definitely doing that now with all of their teams, sitting down and looking at the current percentage of economic activity assured, aligning that to the future assurance plan and saying, well, in light of these qualifying factors, where are the big items that we need to assure to move up that curve faster? And because we are looking to move a lot of our top 100 taxpayers to justified trust by the end of the year, whilst maintaining the integrity and the core pinnacle of the program in terms of methodology and leaving that largely unchanged. At the same time, trying to really hone in and focus on the areas that are unassured that are going to make the most fundamental difference to both the quantitative threshold and then also the qualifying factors, so that we can be smarter, I think, in terms of how we target our assurance work streams in the top 100, and to be more targeted than maybe what we've been in the past sort of 12 to 18 months, where we have taken a very holistic sweep. I think you'll start to find, exactly to your point, teams will now become more targeted in terms of the assurance work streams, where we're looking to progress to get to justified trust sooner. Yeah.
I think that's the point we were making earlier around, you look at your ratings in terms of how many you've got in high and how many need to move, and the need for the expectations of the tax office and taxpayers to meet in terms of how you get there and how quickly you can get there. And I think, one of the points that we might discuss later is the fact that the tax gap in the large market is very small, and I know the ATO has aspirations to make it smaller, so it all has to feed into the one channel. So I think Kamlesh's point is, yes, we all want to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and Belle, it'll be up to the teams on the ground to convey that and to, I guess, begin to sort of really live this approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. And execution is always the central pinnacle.
Yeah.
I think you can think about the strategy and the approach, but ultimately it becomes a question in each and every case that those principles are lived and applied consistently. Yeah.
Just a comment on the guiding principles. One of the things that I think, particularly in the top 1,000 market, but not unheard of for top 100, is this is not perfection in terms of your guiding principles. How quickly will that change into perfection? And it's very similar along the lines to, okay, the tax gap at this point in time, relatively small. We all aspire to get it smaller. But again, it's the cost of trying to aim for a more perfection version of these qualitative measures, which could be a struggle for large corporates without necessarily a return to the country in regards to, yes, are we actually collecting more? Are we actually capturing behaviour that we couldn't see before, because we want to get to a higher level on these qualitative factors?
Thanks very much for raising that, because I did want to say that if we could go to the slide on the qualifying factors. So that those are very much at the moment, and a lot of the thinking we've been talking about is very much in the top 100 space. In the top 1,000 space, we're substantially aligned to that, and that is where we want to get to, and I think this is what you're calling out. We started our program in 2016, and in 2016, the top 1,000 market, which starts from economic groups, not just companies, but economic groups with turnover 250 million, going up to those with a couple of billion turnover, but a large percentage under 500 million turnover. They don't have a head of tax, they may have a CFO, and so our tax governance framework was something that really wasn't on their radar. So right from an early start, we've been accepting stage 1 governance for high assurance. So we do additional work. One of the core questions that we always ask the teams, or the teams will actually talk about, is when they look into the tax effect accounting working papers, they look into the STI and the working papers, are they finding errors? And do they have confidence? Does the person they're speaking with understand what they're talking about? And are they able to provide us the information that we need? So in a sense, we use our professional judgment as to the level of confidence we have in relation to the years that we've reviewed. So top 1,000 is very much, we look back at the years that have, I suppose, the income years that are still open, but in relation to lodged returns. And so tax governance, we do have a different approach. Also in the effective tax borne, when we started in 2016, it was still, I suppose, a lot more in development than what it is now, and the thinking is a lot more refined. So there are two areas where there's quite a bit of difference. We also take more of a top-down approach. So for me, they're probably the two big differences, but this is where we want to get to. I will say that. The question is, what's the timeline? And I think, Zennia, I think that's probably what you're calling out as well, is let's let everybody know this is what we need, this is where we want to get to, but what's a reasonable amount of time for the CFO or the head of tax, if there is a head of tax, to be able to put these things in place without it being too big an impost. Keeping in mind that as part of the assurance approach, and I was reflecting earlier about the change to an assurance approach, we are seeking to obtain high assurance, and that's part of our shrinking the tax gap has been called out here, and also to maintain that. So you can expect we will review the top 1,000 market again, but that's all I can say at this point in time. And also that we're thinking about what's the most efficient and effective way to do it, and very much seeking to leverage the information that we receive. So really leveraging data to make it as, I suppose, less costly in terms of time and expense for all of us.
No, thanks, Judy. I think they're all really important points to explain, particularly the approach in the Top 1,000 program. I think I liked your expression about it's not perfection, and I think sometimes my family's a bit critical of me about being a perfectionist. And what I would say is that I think they're pragmatic. I think the 90% threshold is, again, or about 90% is indicative of, as you said, Michelle, not looking under every rock, not looking at the minutiae. And I think too, as you can see from qualifying factors 3 and 4, there are minimum medium assurance. We're not attaining the high assurance in each and every requirement in each and every category. I think they're not seeking perfection. I think it's pragmatic. Yeah, but time will tell, and I think we'd be interested in feedback and comments, particularly in the next session as part B of the agenda. If you have thoughts or comments, I'm very happy to hear them.
Yeah, we might get moving.
Okay.
We've got about 9 minutes to cover ETB and Gst Performance Ratio, so hold on to your seats.
It'll be whirlwind. Okay. So I'll touch quickly on some future directions, because there are some very exciting things happening in terms of the alignment and integration that we spoke about earlier in terms of a whole of tax approach, and also in terms of the world of automation and data analytics. I'll just skip over those first two elements on this slide in terms of the future directions, because I feel that we have covered that through the panel discussion very, very nicely. And the factor that's on there around the next action work, that we will be checking in on those next action next time we engage with you. So what I'd like to focus on is the final component of the slide, just in the interest of time. And I'll also move quite quickly through ETB and the Gst Performance Ratio work streams, which are in development. If there are areas of particular interest, and just because we've only got 9 minutes and can't cover them in the depth that we had planned today, please feel free to reach out to Judy or myself, and we do have quite a few subject matter experts in the room today with us that you can speak to in the morning tea break. So in terms of the automation element of the assurance work streams, certainly our analysis of the quantitative and qualitative information we're gathering to support differentiated approaches is also helping to inform where we might take low value, high volume active assurance work and automating that in the future so that our case officers can focus on analytics and value added work. We are seeking to use increased data sources to data match client data and identify issues, and automatic pre-filling information where we can in tax assurance reports. And as part of that, streamlining the profiling as well that sits behind our TARs and STARs, and pulling the insights and intel to better inform our data systems and technology to identify systemic themes and patterns, contributing to building that richer picture of intelligence for further tailoring differentiated approaches across our whole public groups and multinational business population. By 2024, we hope to be much more progressed and significantly advanced in our data and analytics capacity in that regard. And there's small steps being taken now. So for example, in the world of ETB that I'll move on to in a moment, we are working with business analysts in our Smarter Data business line to improve our ETB workbook by automating parts of the ETB that are data-driven, for example. So in terms of ETB, I'll just touch on the key highlights here. In terms of our first-year tax assurance reports, the ETB calculations have tended to be reasonably low resolution, drawing information from within the ATO and public sources. We're moving now into second-year ETB analysis in many TARs. The analysis itself is becoming more sophisticated, working more closely with taxpayers on data sets and increased transparency to help refine our assumptions and proxies in terms of offshore profit margins as well as foreign taxes paid. We do have a number of taxpayers in the Top 100 program working with us to improve the accuracy of our ETB analysis, and we're seeing the collaboration through sharing workbooks and guidance, leading to more enhanced ETB analysis as part of the justified trust methodology. We are working through, though, as part of our ETB work streams and acknowledging and identifying opportunities to simplify the process in appropriate circumstances. Whilst maintaining the integrity of the underlying methodology, we are certainly taking steps this year, and you'll see that through your ETB analysis. We're really fine-tuning and finessing where we can simplify the ETB work streams and apply it to your business. So we're currently compartmentalizing our top 100 taxpayers into 4 categories, depending on the nature of the business and the integration of the value chain. Where you are wholly or substantially a domestic business, we'll be doing a very simple ETB calculation, where largely the Australian accounting profit is what we'll use as your ETB profit in terms of your Australian linked business. Where you have your operations, whoops. Oh no, it's still up there. Sorry, I've just lost the slides down there, but you can at least still see them, so that's great. As I was saying, where you have Australian operations that are functionally isolated from overseas, we'll be doing a much narrower scoped ETB on the Australian subgroup only. And in the same category is where we have a high level of assurance across transfer pricing or key ETB risk areas. So again, just seeing that more simplified approach to foreign tax paid and Australian linked business activities if your business fits that type of profile. The 4th category is largely the same as the prior year. If you have material overseas operations or your Australian business is functionally integrated with your offshore value chain, we will still seek to run the full ETB as we've been doing currently. So we're hopeful that in the simplification process, we'll start to work through that ETB analysis in a more streamlined way for you. Also looking at working more closely with our Top 1000 program in terms of when a full ETB analysis may be warranted. And some things we're thinking about there are obviously Australian headquartered companies, probably not. Similarly, if you're covered to a large extent by an existing APA or bilateral APA, then similarly it probably won't be, but you will start to see more emphasis in terms of an ETB next time we cover the top 1,000 population, as well as if you have a very integrated value chain where there's probably scope and merit to further exploring an ETB in your top 1,000 review. We are working on some processes and tools to assist companies and their advisors with preparing ETBs, and things like agreed upon procedures and greater guidance are currently in development. Something where we are wanting to work with you, particularly given that ETB is one of the qualifying factors to achieve high assurance, so we're hopeful that the new streamlined approach and some of these tools will help taxpayers across the full top 100 population meet that qualifying factor. So that was very quick and probably only a small subset of what I was going to cover on the ETB. Very happy to talk through ETB in the break or out of session if you've got particular questions. In terms of the Gst Performance Ratio, this is a tool that large corporates and the ATO can use to provide insights and help us understand variances between economic performance in your financial statements and GST outcomes. It is a tool that we are still developing and testing in terms of the underlying methodology. We are seeing some interest from companies in terms of using it themselves, and we identified at the moment that there's some practical challenges with respect to implementation. So we are wanting to test that more thoroughly with companies and seek feedback and suggestions. If you are interested in working with us as we develop that process and helping with the further testing in terms of how we apply some of our current thinking, please email Judy Morris in the Top 1000 mailbox, either to find out more information or to express interest in working with us. In terms of at a high level, the methodology, we do use the financial statements to understand economic performance, and then see how we can progress from that level to looking at the GST group, and then also considering the gross revenue and gross expenditure isolated for GST. It is a work in progress and something that we are refining in terms of understanding the composition then in terms of the GST performance across taxable supplies, GST-free supplies, what's input taxed as well as out of scope. But at the sort of very heart of the methodology is a desire to understand how your business is performing and your GST outcomes. So it's a little bit similar to the ETB in that sense, really driven by wanting to understand the tax drivers. And obviously ETB is income tax focused. This is a tool that we're seeking to develop to provide those same types of insights in understanding your economic performance and GST outcomes. Again, quite high level, but I'll just pause there to see if there's any questions, reflections or comments. Thanks everybody.
We might make it brief and then we'll use time after the break to... All right, well, on that note, we've got 20 minutes for morning tea, so be back here at 11:20 sharp for part 2, which will be observations and questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
So as I said earlier, part B is about engaging with the panel about their experiences so far with the 2 initiatives and providing a bit of a practical reflection on that. So I might just kick off and start with Kamlesh. So as you know, Kamlesh is head of AGL's tax function. Bit about AGL. AGL's a ASX-listed organisation with predominantly Australian operations. Actually no material operations outside of Australia, so limited TP risk there. AGL was very early to sign up to the Voluntary Tax Transparency Code and was amongst the first of taxpayers to publish Part A and B. Through my research, I got the sense that taxation and transparency is very important to AGL. In fact, I saw it listed as one of the 4 pillars of economic performance, which also includes financial management, capital investment for growth and reliable energy. So, Kamlesh, my question is what does it feel like to work in an organisation that places tax governance so high up on its list? In particular, what level of engagement do you have with the C-suite and the board?
Thank you. So we're in a highly regulated industry, and really, even if you were in an industry which is not highly regulated, after the Royal Commission, I think all directors are very acutely aware of getting it right with all regulatory authorities. So our board's been pretty big on that. Secondly, I don't think any boards like surprises. And we've got our new CEO who was actually the ex-CFO. So from a board perspective, I'm required to present on tax twice a year. And that paper covers everything. So the more strategic things that we might be doing on transactions, dividends, franking credits, what the risks are, what traction we've had, discussions we've had with the ATO, state taxes, OSRs, etc. So board is acutely aware of that. In addition to that, at half year end, year end, I sign off on a rep letter to the CEO, CFO, which goes as part of the audit committee to the board, and again outlines any other changes between the other 2 papers that I've provided. And we have 5 audit and risk committee meetings a year, and at every meeting there is a compliance pack, which includes all legal things, any breach of policies. Has a couple of slides on tax. So the board and audit committee are absolutely acutely aware of all the major drivers as far as tax is concerned.
Thank you. And also, just to lead on to that, how's your experience been under the Top 100 program, and whether you might have any tips to offer other heads of tax within a top 100 organisation based on what you've learned so far?
Yeah. So when we first, in fact, just before the Justified Trust program started, my style is to be very transparent, open, and go on the front foot, so to speak, in terms of engaging with the ATO. So I started early in the piece, would have been more than 2 years ago, where we could see changes in our industry, especially after Hazelwood closed down abruptly, and there was this huge increase in wholesale electricity prices on the eastern seaboard. That was a massive change, and therefore, when you look forward to what that might mean, that had huge implications. So I tried to engage with the ATO at that time with our team, and we have a great relationship with them, to kind of say, without saying too much, obviously it's market-sensitive information, but to kind of say, look at the drivers in the industry, things are about to change. At the first board meeting, audit committee meeting that we had after we started, I talked about the Justified Trust journey, told the board it's going to be quite a long journey and it's going to involve a lot of work. One of my directors turned around and said, that's all well and good, Kamlesh, but it's very invasive. Now, that may have been experienced from another company that the director was on. But I said, look, yes, it will be, but we will get to a better place. So we've had a lot of traction. We found that a thing that really helped was actually making a lot of presentations. And the starting point was really telling people, telling our team in the ATO about our business, what drives the business and what are the complications around our business. And look, we are all, basically in Australia, you kind of think generation electricity sell, but there are complications. We like an investment bank in electricity. And so there are a lot of nuances. And so I found that it was really, really helpful to make presentations and share information with our team in the ATO. The other thing we found was really talking about the drivers. What would, change in wholesale electricity prices, what does it mean? And there are, quirks, nuances in our group, for example, and this is publicly available information. We've got 2 tax consolidate groups, and one of them's got tax losses. And therefore, it has implications when these drivers change. And so being on the front foot to say, look, these are some of the changes that, if you look at the horizon. So that's gone down well. We have spent a lot of time providing information. And the thing that struck me the most is we have always had to do more with less resources, and this has taken up a lot of time. We do see it as an investment, so we are spending the time there, but we then have some questions that come back, where we go, how is it relevant? And hence my comment earlier about when I look at those couple of key slides, effective tax rate, effective tax borne, leave out the couple of nuances. The thing here is, what is the risk that you're looking for? And so we've asked that question a few times. I think initially in the piece, the tax team might have been, I thought reluctant, but I found that after a while, I kept asking, what is that you're looking for? What are you still worried about? We haven't gone to the bottom of that as yet, but we find that the information is free-flowing more now than it was in the past. So my thing is be transparent and really try and make sure that the tax team is aware of the drivers in your business, and invest that time. The one thing where we thought we needed to do more work was in the governance area, in the sense that there were things, for example, gap analysis, which initially, I was a bit reluctant to kind of say, to impose something on our board to say this is what the ATO requires us to do is a bit of a difficult task. But where we landed was we are engaging with our auditors to use agreed upon procedures to actually get further up the curve on that. So I think that'll get us to a better place too.
Very good, thank you. Yes, it highlights an interesting point, and Kamlesh and I were talking about this in the break, that quite often responding to justified trust questions are in addition to someone's ordinary day job. So as you can imagine, when there are questions that are asked that, you know, might not have that nexus to fixing a tax gap, you know, someone's there at 3 a.m. in the morning looking for this document, it might hurt a bit. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I'm sure it'll evolve over time, where organisational resources are sort of lagging behind the requirements of sort of external parties such as the ATO, and now we see the Board of Tax with their new recommendations on TDC. So yeah, much to see in that space. Thank you, Kamlesh. That's very good.
Could I say one thing?
Of course.
I was just going to encourage everyone that if you are in a situation like Kamlesh has done, I think as he highlighted, going back to the team and asking them to explain the question that they've asked or the document that they're seeking, all of our teams should be well placed to articulate for you exactly why they're requesting the information that they have. And I think Kamlesh's approach to that sounded perfect, with very collaborative and engaged approach. But absolutely, I would encourage you, if you're not sure why you've been asked a question, definitely circle back to the team and better understand that.
Very good suggestion. Thanks, Belinda. All right, Zennia, I might throw to you next. So Zennia is the head of tax for Schneider Electric Australia. So for those who don't know, Schneider Electric is listed on the Paris Stock Exchange. Their operations, Australian operations, are not really material to the group, with about 3% of global revenue coming from Australia, or that's 1.1 billion. I'd like that to be not material for me. But yeah, so I went through, trawling through one of the financial statements, I think the 2017 financial statements, and in one of the back indexes there was a importance of issues matrix in there, which measures the importance of issues for external stakeholders, and according to Schneider Electric, tax transparency was in there, so that's very positive. And obviously being headquartered out of France, that they're an OECD nation. But what I did notice in there, tax transparency appears about mid-range, so there are quite a number of factors sort of either side of tax transparency. I guess my question to you, Zennia, is firstly, what's your experience been like in the Top 1000 program? And I'd like to sort of angle into where your organisational support has been, and sort of, you know, where you are getting your support from, whether that's locally or internationally, and whether they agree with some of the questions you're asking them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I might just touch on the fact that, you know, as you said, Australia is materially insignificant to the group. We like to think that we are quite significant to the group in what we do here. But with justified trust being an OECD measure, one of the biggest surprises probably for me sitting within Australia and New Zealand is that none of my colleagues in other jurisdictions are having to go through a similar justified trust program with their tax authorities. So we're talking about France, we're talking about US, we're talking about sort of Russia and so forth. Now, that all of these jurisdictions have their own measures of compliance and adherence to tax laws, but probably not as formalised as what we're seeing with the ATO. So a lot of my job is actually really lobbying and making aware to the rest of the Schneider group what justified trust frameworks do look like, and what they actually mean for us internally in the way that we should operationalise ourselves as well. So you quite clearly pointed out that tax transparency is an important issue for us. So is business integrity, which is one of our highest issues. And the other side of that is privacy and data security as well. So whilst we do want to maintain transparency with the tax authorities, we also want to be very careful about what information we are sharing out there in the general public, and how that is being used, and also to, I suppose, temper the publication of a lot of material that would be commercially sensitive to our group is not necessarily required elsewhere in the world, and so that dictates a lot of what our behaviour is like as well. So that's probably just putting things into context as to where Schneider is, Australia, compared to the rest of the Schneider organisation. In terms of our experience with Top 1000, I think that we're fairly sort of, we're probably in the mid stages of our review. We've had our RFI request, which was very much in line with what the typical questions asked were. And so we didn't find anything sort of adverse that was being asked for in that regard. And given that we had been through sort of tax compliance review and tax audit sort of previously, it probably was a little bit surprising that the extent of the information that was asked for was sort of quite similar along those lines. But I think one of the key things to remember is that the purpose of this justified trust is to ensure that we are paying the right tax, that it's being correctly reported, and that we can actually prove that. And the only way that we can actually prove that is by actually providing vast amounts of information to the tax office to demonstrate our compliance with the laws. And probably also keeping in mind that the tax office has limited knowledge of our business. And to echo what Kamlesh has said, we do welcome the opportunity to actually share with the tax office what our business is about and what our drivers are as well, to actually help put into context where tax decision making is falling as well in that regard. So,
thank you very much. Yes, not an uncommon situation for an inbound to have to beg for information, but then that information is commercially sensitive up the line. So it's quite a tightrope to walk, and I mean, unknown unknowns from the ATO side where you don't know whether that information is relevant and you're having to rely on the taxpayer. But obviously the heads of tax globally are saying, well, no, it's not relevant. So yes, that can be quite a tension in some information requests. Michelle, I might go to you next. And I think you alluded to this earlier in part A, is that CTA has been quite collaborative with the ATO and around some of the frameworks and adjusting I guess how the Justified Trust Initiative is run. It's quite an impressive organisation. I think there's 126 member companies now, give or take, most of which are Australia's largest taxpayers. So I guess you receive a lot of good information from your members around experiences in this environment. And I'd just like to point out, I saw CTA's vision, which I really like, and this is a good benchmark, I think, for us as a nation. It's to achieve an internationally competitive and robust corporate tax system under which large corporates willingly meet their obligations in a timely and transparent manner. So that vision statement actually touches on a lot of aspects we've been talking about today around efficiency and, the right amount of tax and stuff like that. So I might just throw this question to you. In your view, does the Justified Trust Initiative get some credit for Australia's large corporate tax base, and in particular the tax gap? And what role do you think the JT will take going forward?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a direct correlation between tax assured and tax gap. And that was something that people, I guess, only sort of understood as the Justified Trust process rolled out. And in saying that, what I mean is the more tax that the ATO can assure, the smaller the gap.
Yep.
And the better profile the large corporate tax system has in terms of compliance. So I think the important thing about the Justified Trust program that we've certainly been continually talking to our members about is it's important to remember it's not just about tax assured, it's about public perception. And, the Justified Trust Initiative came about sort of at the height of the Senate inquiry into corporate tax avoidance. There was a perceived need to assure the public that large corporates were paying the right amount of tax. So in that sense, I can understand the ATO's drivers in terms of wanting a consistent approach to the large market, that they could effectively sell to the public that yes, we have a good handle on this market. From the CTA's perspective, that is not telling us anything we didn't know. I think that's the point that I would make from the perspective of our members. There is an irony in the fact that I think it's probably a fair assessment that large corporates in Australia have never been more risk averse. They've never had a more stringent corporate tax system with which to comply with, and they've never paid more tax. So you do have a bit of tension between the concept of justified trust and the reality that, large corporates by and large can be trusted. So that's sort of why we're here and why we're at this point now. So yes, I do think it's helpful, and I do think that if we can together deliver this final piece in terms of actually demonstrating to the public that a large percentage of large corporates have achieved justified trust with the tax office, then I think it's been an effective program.
Yeah.
Can I just add something to that? And that is, as from a regulator's perspective, looking at the Australian tax and super systems, we're very fortunate. We have high levels of willing participation. That's government speak, but that means most tax is paid without us having to take active compliance action. And that contrasts with some other jurisdictions around the world. And that is...
I have a stat on the US actually. So their tax gap's about 7%, and that's 7% of $406 billion US dollars. So their tax gap's quite big.
Yeah.
But I was just going to talk in terms of willing participation, and that is based on community confidence. And I've been in the tax office nearly 9 years. It took me quite a while to just realise how important that community confidence is. So in addition to what you're talking about, and getting the message out about that large corporates do pay about the right amount of tax, it's not only important for large business, it's important for us. Absolutely. Because our research shows that if small business, self-employed, people think that the large market's not paying their fair share of tax, that influences their choices. So I probably want to say that there are two prongs to that. Yeah.
Yes, no, I agree.
And you're well aware of that.
Yes, I am.
Thank you very much. Tony, I might throw to you now. So there's many ways to skin a cat, so to speak, and I think when we look at some of the earlier sentiment from Kamlesh, sort of around, resourcing tensions and having the amount of people there, you're quite experienced in the realm of tax technology. Where do you see that world playing a part in this scenario?
I guess from where I sit and the exposure that we have, we look at it from a different perspective, from a different lens. So what I present is, I guess, through the lens of a technology provider that specialises in tax, automation, process improvement and risk management. And the piece that we've touched on, but we haven't dwelt on, is the piece that Judy talked about, it's maintenance. So we talk about trying to get most taxpayers into a high assurance rating by 2020. We talk about the light at the end of the tunnel and what we need to get to the point where we get that tax assurance certificate, but then there is a different reality that follows on that. And with tax assurance and justified trust, it's actually quite a big paradigm shift so far as compliance is concerned. In the sense that whilst we talk about coming back every 3 years or diving back in when there are significant changes, a lot of things happen within 3 years. So the piece that runs through my mind is pretty much how do you actually maintain and stay on top of that, because it's a big impost on very resource-stretched organisations as it is. You don't want to have to go through that pain again in 3 years' time. So we're sort of privileged to be in a situation where we talk a lot to the tax office and a wide cross-section of clients. And I just want to sort of share some observations of what we see. When we talk to the tax office is after some very specific pieces of information, but at a breadth and a depth that we haven't seen before. And we're going through a journey in trying to get that articulated. When we go through to corporations, they're scrambling to try and find the information that they need. The information's there, but it's in lots of different mediums, lots of different forms, particularly when you're trying to collect evidence. So it takes a lot of time to pull that together. In terms of the benefit, I guess, and the incentive of getting a positive assurance rating, the other reality at this point in time is that if you look at the top 100, 95% of the respondents are actually still below high. If you look at the top 1,000 out of the 30% that have actually been reviewed so far, 69% of those are still below that high rating. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done. So to bring all of that together, when we look at what do we need to do going forward, if you think about your compliance process, when I joined tax, I was of the generation that used to photocopy thick tax returns and run down to the local restaurant to get our clients to sign and quickly run into the tax office and put it in the in-tray at 1 minute to 4. So we've lived through that, through self-assessment, through the risk management framework, where it was a very focused dive into specific areas, to the move to positive assurance, which came through initially with GST, with the cooperative assurance arrangement, and now in a big way around tax assurance. So really what it means is, yes, there is a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of getting that positive assurance, but I guess my message is, once we get to that point, you need to start thinking about some specific things for the medium to long term. So we talk about book-to-tax reconciliations, data points, trends, to be able to report that. What you don't want to be doing is going through all those manual processes to pull that together. The technology and the process exists today to try and automate that, so you should be looking at that. We talk about effective tax borne. How many organisations still don't have a streamlined way of actually managing their global tax affairs? If you're not doing that, how do you actually bring that to make that process easier? When you think about the evidence that you need to collect, evidence is quite a deep piece. There's the advice and the execution and the reporting of that. Yes, you may go through as part of your initial tax assurance review to try and pull all your year-to-date evidence, but what about the next 3 years? What processes and tools and what kind of repositories do you set up to actually start supporting all the positions going forward? And then leaning on Kamlesh's point, tax has always been frustrating, I guess, from the time that I started in tax. We've always been finance's poor cousins. So finance was always very much front of mind of the board, was always getting funding for all the systems and processes. Slowly but surely, tax has come onto the radar, but I think the piece that Kamlesh talked about in terms of getting in front of the board and making them aware of what you need to do is quite important. But there's the next step after that is actually getting their support to give you the resources and the funding that you need to be able to deal with what you need to report, because this piece is not going away. This is not a one-time event. This is something that is now going to be part of the permanent compliance process. So as part of that, in the same way as traditionally you've thought about how do you automate your processes internally, how do you automate your reporting, this is now, I guess, the next step in the journey. So to start thinking about what does 2020, 2021, 22 look like, and how much work does that impose on your team, and how can you automate and set up permanent processes and systems to be able to deal with that.
Thanks, Tony. To validate that, we sent out a survey before this event and basically asked everyone in the audience, hopefully, how you're proposing to manage the ongoing requirements of justified trust. The most popular answer was process improvements, followed by technology, and then additional staff. So I guess might be a tight labour market out there for tax specialists. So respondents are now looking to, how do they improve their process? And it's always easy to know what the requirements are now once you've gone through the process and know what the questions are going to be. But so there's some acknowledgement there that, it's not just about overloading staff, and there is a technology and process improvement aspect to that. And some of the challenges, there's another question on what are the biggest challenges. So to that, there's collection of data. So, going and asking or pulling up old files. Hopefully there's no restaurant stamp tax returns in that box of shoes or whatever. I think the data that we've gained through this survey is saying that there's a lot of data involved, and we as taxpayers need to invest in processes and systems to meet the ATO's requirements under justified trust. So I think what we might do, we're right on 12 o'clock, so we'll open up for audience questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. And while you're thinking of your questions, I might just butt in with one of my own. And I'll first direct this one at Belinda and Judy, but the other panellists might want to comment on this. So at the end of February, I was reading the AFR and I noticed a comment from Jeremy Hirsch on, and I'll quote, Jeremy said, "I won't step away from the fact that there are some partners in those firms that we would consider as disrupting the system. And so we certainly look very closely at their activities and how we can address those activities." So that comment, to me, I sit back and reflect on that and say, well, there are a few rogues out there in the market. How are their activities impacting, or are we seeing an impact from those individuals in the justified trust lens? And what's that doing to the taxpayers' rating? I assume there's PCGs out there that are probably aligned to those partners' activities, but yeah, I'd like to ask the question about how that's impacting the justified trust ratings.
Well, I'm happy to make a few comments to start with. That's a great question. It's probably not one that we really expected, I'll have to admit.
Sorry. They're always a good question, it's the one you don't expect.
The best part is so you can see us going, oh my gosh, how are we going to answer this one?
You're welcome.
So Jeremy has talked about, and it's probably another side to what I was talking about earlier when I talked about our taxpayer alerts and our PCGs, that we want to get our view to the market before, I suppose, types of transactions or activities or positions. We use the word proliferate. So they're used in multiple places. So that's where we were a number of years ago. And it's a very long process, and it's a more painful process for the large corporates when we come years after the event and say, we've got concerns with this, because, you know, it goes a long way back, interest, penalties, etc. So we are very much trying through our messaging to markets, trying to be on the front foot. In terms of the sorts of transactions that really give us concerns, in the top 1,000 space, I'd probably have to say we've seen a few, and they're certainly sorts of things that we red flag in particular, so it's probably structuring sorts of things that we'll red flag and we really push through to audit very quickly. We are interested, if there is something new or unusual, to try and get a sense of whether or not that might be something that we could see be adopted more broadly in the market. So that's probably more how I would say what we're seeing in the top 1,000 space.
Yeah, it's one observation I've made about PCGs. They're really timely in terms of curbing behaviour. Historically, without PCGs, it might be a ruling or something else, or a case, which could take 4 to 5 years to, get on top of that behaviour. And in 4 and 5 years, things can seem normal, activities can seem normal over that stretch of time.
And they're the sorts of things, we don't want something to be, that has concerns for us to be normalised.
Yes.
And then afterwards, it's quite concerning and for a whole raft of people.
And Andrew, I think I'd fully echo Judy's sentiments and certainly would be calling it out in the same way that Judy's articulated in the Top 100 program. I think there's probably another angle that I would just touch on there, and the quote from Jeremy does relate to questionable conduct from advisors in some situations and in limited circumstance. I think Judy and I have received very positive engagement from a number of the Big Four firms, and they are offering some good service offerings as well around some of the justified trust work streams. So I guess the only thing I would add to balance the observations is just to say that we are seeing some good levels of engagement across all the firms around justified trust and genuine interest in wanting to work with their client base to help them reach a high level of assurance too.
No, that's a very good point. Yeah, it does need to be balanced, and I would say that happens in most of the situations.
I think one of the points I've made to Jeremy in the past, and I say this with love to the advisory firms, but when advisory firms start making a lot of money, I start worrying. And the justified trust program has paid for some Italian
Yes.
tiles in pools, I think, which, you know, is all part of it. We understand it's a labour-intensive process. However, you know, with corporates like certainty, advisors don't mind uncertainty,
Yeah.
and you know, there's space to meet in the middle. But certainly, we are conveying any areas of uncertainty where we see there's a higher level of activity in the advisory space. We let the tax office know. But in saying that, the particular article you're talking about, I think, is in relation to legal professional privilege. I think maybe. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that in any detail, but we've certainly encouraged the tax office to deal with the advisors who are, I guess, pushing the boundaries, whether it be in the context of legal professional privilege or other areas, so that the corporates that are using them are aware of the concerns, and that the concerns do not, I guess, you know, impact the reputation of the advisory profession more generally. So there are two sides to that coin, but certainly it's the LPP one's a tricky one. But more broadly, I think you know, the tax office has been working very closely with the advisory community, and I think the last session that you did on justified trust was very successful and was run with the firms. Yeah.
Yes, I have heard a rumour that there's going to be an LPP case on the horizon. So,
Can I just add to that? Corporates generally will actually go to an advisor that actually matches the corporate's risk appetite.
Yeah.
So you know, it's not firms. It could be individuals.
yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah.
So what I might do, I didn't realise my question would take so much time, but I'd like to ask a few questions from the audience. So we've got Courtney up in the middle and Craig on the left-hand side for a roving mic. Don't leave me hanging.
And Andrew, I actually did get asked 2 questions in the break, so I'm
Okay.
happy just to share those questions whilst we arrange
Yeah, thank you.
the questions from the audience.
Forget the awkward silence.
They're very quick. So they were good questions that I'm sure other people are probably mulling over as well. So in the slide that I think of in my own mind as the Homer Simpson slide, because it's got the 3 donut charts on it, there's a reference there to TBI, and it had the sort of the shading around coverage. Just to clarify that TBI stands for Total Business Income, in case you were curious around the abbreviation. And the second question that we got in the morning tea break related to the reference, and this is on the slide that talked through the differentiated client experience and the rely, verify, refresh. There's a reference to having a differentiated client experience across that spectrum in top 100 and top 320. And there was just a little bit of confusion around the top 320 reference, and I just wanted to confirm that that's the top echelon of our private and wealthy groups population. And when I shared the slide deck, they just asked me to include a reference to their program so that it was clear that that consistency in client experience transcends from public and multinational businesses into the top 320 in the private wealthy group space. So just clarifying that reference as well. Thanks, Andrew.
All right.
If there are no questions that have been identified, then there was one question that I was asked that I wasn't able to answer fully before we had to come up here. So I may not get it completely right, but I think it was more in relation to in the top 1,000, we have a top 1,000 income tax focused streamlined assurance review, and how will that fit then with the GST streamlined review, and what can we expect in that space, particularly as we have now undergone the realignment within the ATO. So I'll just make a few comments, and then we do have a number of ATO experts I'm going to throw to my GST colleagues sitting in the front row if they'd like to add some comments. So and people always laugh at me because I often say it depends, and it will very much depend on the business, but there are often situations, and most situations, where we can leverage the information that we've obtained in an income tax streamlined assurance review to provide a basis for a GST review, and my colleagues can talk about when, under our current approaches, when there may be a GST streamlined assurance review. So if we have an income tax review first, we would go through the normal processes, and our GST colleagues will work closely with us and look to see how they can leverage the information. And so, for example, governance, there is a lot of alignment in relation to governance, to additional controls for indirect tax, and also significant and new transactions, albeit we come at it from different perspectives. And so that is the way I see that we have a streamlined assurance review for income tax, and then a GST review will follow at some stage afterwards, which would leverage that information. So Jenny or Nick, is there a microphone near you that should actually provide maybe a little bit more information about what's happening in the GST space?
Sure, thanks Judy for that question. Yes, in the GST space, basically the general approach is where the income tax streamline assurance review commences first, and the GST streamline assurance review commences when that finalises. In first instance, we do not start from the beginning. Our first basis is the information that it has already been obtained through the income tax streamline assurance review, and we do leverage off the governance review income tax is undertaken, and we also look at the significant new transactions, and we look at the same transactions and specifically around the GST treatment, whether that accords with the GST law. So very much so from the beginning, we do leverage off all the work that's already been commenced initially and finalised, and we leverage off the outcomes of that review, and that actually feeds into our process as well under the justified trust methodology.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-up question on that. And quite often, say, within an organisation, there's a direct tax team and then there's an indirect tax team, and so there's a level of separation within an organisation, and not always that information marries up. So, you know, if you're going to try and tie in a trial balance to a set of GST disclosures, that doesn't work perfectly the first go. So how are you finding that in that crossover of, you know, we've done a justified trust review for direct tax and now we have to go on and validate GST. How does that work?
I'm happy to make an observation first, which is, again, it depends on the business, but you're right in, well, first of all, probably in the top 1,000 space, often it is one person who looks after all the taxes. But yes, the marrying up of the information, so the GST group can be different from the income tax group, can be different from the financial reporting group. So we're aware of those challenges. And I would probably, one of the questions I would ask then, well, how do you obtain assurance? How do you look at it? And sorry, Jenny, you were going to say something there.
I was just going to say that in some instances there are differences in terms of when we do apply the justified trust methodology, that in most cases the GST group that we're looking at, it is quite different to the entity within the top 1,000 program. So whilst there might be leverage opportunities, especially around the tax governance and the board level controls, with the managerial controls, we more than likely we will need to actually veer off and look at specifically the GST group and be more specific around the system type issues and the integrity of the system, because that is integral to the correct reporting on the BAS.
Thank you very much. All right, I'll...
Can I just
we've got, oh, yep, sorry, Kamlesh.
Just add to that, only because we, I guess, had double barrel between our eyes in the sense that we had income tax and GST started last year. If I can just share a couple of things, because I think there is a disconnect between what some of the teams are asking and doing and what Canberra head office is looking for. To give you a couple of examples, so we've got a GST meeting, our second meeting tomorrow. Originally, the team that came around said exactly what you said. We will use whatever information you've given to our tax colleagues. Great. There was a slight change in the team, and then there was an agenda requirement or sent out in terms of, for our next meeting. We were asked to set aside 2 days. And I said, no, it's not happening. We don't need it, it's not happening, and here's the agenda, and we can do it within 2 hours. Despite that, we've allocated 5 hours tomorrow, which I kind of go, this is overkill on all sorts of fronts. So that's one observation. The other observation is also we've shared a lot of information. I've already mentioned that earlier. At some point, there's not much return on further information. And there were a couple of instances where we've actually given opinions, shared opinions, voluntarily. But then we then asked for a copy of the engagement letter. So I will be using your names, actually, Belinda and Judy, to say, we've been told to push back. Why do you need to have that? So we're going to use your names liberally.
Well done.
I actually made that comment, so I recently did a series of them and say, yes, you can use my name. And then I do go and tell the local SES and the local directors, you'll probably, and this is what I said. But it's Belinda's.
Who's heard it as well?
And a direct line, no, I'm kidding. So we've got a question up here in the middle, so who's...
Can I just say, look, thanks very much for that feedback. It's really good to hear that and to know about it. And, thank you.
And I wouldn't mind adding to that as well, and I think that the time that actually has been set aside with your team really comes back down to what I said earlier about having to actually veer off around the managerial level controls that are really specific to the GST system. So a lot of that time is really around looking at, your BAS preparation process, understanding your IT systems and how they interface with the tax function, and it really comes down to the flow of the transactions and making sure that it is accurate, complete, and how that actually gets reported on the BAS. So it does tie back to the integrity of the data and the BAS reporting as well.
Hi, we haven't signed up to Tax Transparency Code yet, and when I look at all the lovely fluffy reports that are out there on the internet, a lot of them make reference to how much employment and outside of corporate and indirect tax they take. So therefore my question is, how does this process flow in with employment taxes? Will that be dragged into justified trust eventually as well? It's like it's super and whatever.
In terms of employment taxes, at this point in time, the justified trust approach that we're looking at is very much income tax. We're looking further in relation to indirect taxes such as GST and excise. But at this stage, that's what our focus is. Yeah.
All right. I think we're at time, so I might wrap it up in terms of a few of the observations that we've... we've got one last question. All right.
Yeah. I've just got a question about streamlining information and potentially cutting down the efforts once justified trust is achieved. So we're talking about a lot of information being provided to get to justified trust. Are you looking at ways of potentially like streamlining other areas? So for example, the RTP schedules, the IDS schedules, they're getting longer every year, and a lot of the information is duplicated in the justified trust process. So are you looking at ways of streamlining the information in those other areas?
In terms of the top 1,000, because our request for information is out there and is published, we're certainly looking to leverage and use that information. If you give that information to us, then, and it probably isn't right just at this point in time, because we're not getting, certainly the RTP is something that's moving in for the population, and the CBC stuff is still coming through, but we don't want to ask for something twice. So the streamlining would be more on our side in terms of the information that we need. And we're also, there's a lot of work underway to be able to collect and collate that information within the ATO and using data and analytics. And so that information will come through to us. So it will make it much easier for us. And I suppose it's like a check to make sure that we don't ask that information twice. And we'll get much better visibility.
I'm more thinking the top 100 space, just because you do go through the risk reviews, which are quite intense, and lots of information is being provided. And then when you come to do the schedules, it feels like you have to answer the same questions again.
Yeah, so I think I'd probably put a slightly different lens on the importance for us of those RTP schedules, and I acknowledge your point that you're making it in terms of the time it takes to fill those out. They're actually very critical for us once we move into a maintenance phase, because once we lift off and we're into a rely approach, largely we are heavily reliant on your disclosures and the information you provide through things like the reportable tax position schedule. So that will be largely what we're using as our basis for our intelligence and running our data and analytics over. So certainly from a Justified Trust Top 100 perspective, we haven't put forward any recommendations to streamline the reporting requirements. In fact, it's heavily reliant on those same reporting requirements to be able to offer a very light touch, very non-intensive engagement approach with our largest taxpayers is through relying on our data and analytics and your disclosures. So that would be another way to approach the
Thanks, Belinda. Yes, I might try and keep this to time, so I'm going to wrap up really quickly. So my observations are that we're seeing a new generation of the ATO, which is quite collaborative. We've sort of seen that in discussions with the CTA, and even today is a great example of the ATO listening to feedback and obviously being transparent in terms of where they're heading and what they're doing. So that's a massive step forward from what I've observed. But yeah, so massive thank you to Belinda and Judy for presenting today. We didn't get to use the expert panel too much, so you don't deserve too much credit, but thank you, ladies. And a big thank you to the panel. It's not always easy to get up and be the protagonist in terms of raising unpopular topics. So yes, thank you to the panel, and I do have something for you. I'm not going to dig into my bag and grab that now. But yes, so look forward to seeing you all in the future. I'm sure these will be running going forward, just at an appropriate amount of time. So a massive thank you to Heather Ruddick and Tony Athanasio for organising this event today, and certainly the Wesley venue. I am getting a cue from Heather to make sure you fill out your feedback forms and give those to us. We value that, and it helps us choose the events wisely next time. So please do fill those out. Yes, I can hear the papers rustling. That's a good sign. So yes, thanks again for your time today, and look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.